Hi, I'm Dr. Vonda Wright, and this is Hot for Your Health. Join us for conversations on the bleeding edge of science, health, and culture as we bring you tech innovators, thought leaders, and the movers and shakers who are transforming science fiction into your new health reality. Hey everybody, I'm Dr. Vonda Wright. I'm so excited to have you back for another episode of Hot for Your Health. And this week I have to tell you, I have been stalking Dr. Louisa Nicola for quite some time on the internet. She is an accomplished neuroscientist, a trainer of high performers, a high performer herself as an elite athlete, which we'll get to. But on top of that, has started a company called Neuro Athletics, which is a consulting firm for optimizing health, squeezing the peak performance out of people, and frankly, applying it to people like me. I call myself a mere mortal athlete. And so thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to get into everything from the science aspect and then also from my personal experience in the space.
Well, let's start with something people may not be quite as familiar with you now, since you're in your entrepreneur hat, your business building, your performance hat. Tell us about being an elite athlete and how that fits where you're doing what you do now.
Oh my gosh, if someone was to ask you, Vonda, about your clinical experience, your residency, you data back to you being, in residency and working with patients. For me, I really put everything into my career as a triathlete. So I was an elite triathlete. I qualified for Beijing and London. And if you know anything about triathlons, it's three sports. You swim, bike, run. And it was my entire life from around 16 years old to 24, which is when I retired, quote unquote. Oh. But I learned, look, I got to tell you, I learned everything about exercise physiology and human performance from doing that. Because when you have to be the best at three sports, it comes down to millimeters and minutes and seconds. They say that a triathlete actually has four sports because the transition from swim to bike and bike to run. So I was really trying to do everything I could to optimize for that. And I'll tell you a really interesting story. I actually, in 2011, prior to Beijing, I got hit by a car. And I fractured multiple ribs, clavicle, broken bones. And I wanted to get back on the bike, but something was stopping me. And it was a neurological scarcity. And so that's when I was introduced to an EEG scan, believe it or not. Bobby McGee, he was Usain Bolt's trainer. He put an EEG on me, and we measured the electrical activity in my brain, and that's where I was like, oh my gosh, human performance really starts with the brain.
When he did that, was he doing that initially because he thought she was hit off a bike? Maybe this is a concussion, or was it different? Was it recognizing the stress of physically breaking that much? He was wise enough to know the strain on the brain, which consumes most of our energy in the body.
Yeah, the latter of what you just said, because I remember quite vividly, he said, everything comes from the brain. And I said, what are you talking about? He said, listen, he goes, I'm going to mimic. He goes, we're going to measure your heart rate and I'm going to measure your electrical activity. And we actually sat in a dark room for 45 minutes and he took me through a visualization process of doing a triathlon. And what we saw on the EEG, coupled with what we saw, the electrophysiological recordings of my heart, it was all in the same pace as me doing a triathlon. And I thought, but I'm just sitting here. So then I understood the power of the mind. And we kind of, and we kind of used that for me to get back on the bike.
So how do we use that in day-to-day life? How do we understand, like, for instance, I'm going to surgery, it's a tremendous physical drain, I will tell you. And then at the end, I am mentally done, right? So talk to me about the this relationship. And if you only train one, you're abandoning the other, obviously.
Yeah, look, the relationship that I see between, I separate the brain. You've got the brain, which is the hardware, that's the actual tissue, and then you've got the software, which is the mind. And this is, if you talk to any neurologist or neuroscientist, they've all got differing views on this. I'm in that psychiatric bandwagon where I am all for the mind. I separate the mind and I look at the logical aspect of it, and then I look at the primitive part of it, that chimpanzee part where it involves your limbic system, where it is a fight or flight response. So I believe in it with what I just mentioned earlier with my experience with triathlon is when you change the way you think, it changes the neural patterns in your brain, which we know as neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to rewire itself on demand. So the more times you think about one thing, the more times you resurface the neuroplasticity. But neuroplasticity is also involved in the hardware aspect because you've got the rewiring of your brain cells and the synapses of each brain cell. So they're kind of interconnected, right?
So at what level, it gets way beyond my scope of understanding, but at what level, knowing that athletes, you just talked about it, can visualize a performance and improve the performance because they're visualizing it in their brain, knowing that we can influence how we feel, how we perform by what we say to each other, to ourselves. Like, even if we don't feel good, I can say, like this happened this morning. I went to do 4 operations. 2 of them were not my favorite. And so I was tempted to dwell in that I hate these cases I'm going to have to do. But I chose to speak to my brain consciously to override that. I'm a great surgeon, blah, 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 right? The things athletes do. And I end up having a great day. I know how to do what I do, but I had to pivot. But at the same time, what I'm trying to say is if we're capable of talking to our brains and affecting physical performance, who's in charge?
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because what you see in the literature is that the mind follows physiology, meaning that you can change the way you feel through a physiological response. For example, if I am feeling lethargic, if I am tired, if I am not feeling good, and I go out and I do a sprint and I raise my heart rate to its maximum, that is a physiological response. It's going to have, what's going to follow it is I'm going to feel better. And that's because you get the endorphins, the serotonin, etc. Now, what I'm talking about here actually follows the work of Professor Steve Peters. He is a psychiatrist. And what he talks about is that you've got this primitive part of your brain. As I mentioned, the primitive part is that emotional part of the brain that involves the amygdala, it involves our entire limbic system. It is that system. So that system fires first before the logical brain, right? Before the logical mind. Now, in your instance, when you are feeling anything acutely or dwelling on something, you are in the old primitive part. You're in that emotional part of your brain. And it's so easy because that mind, he refers to it as the monkey mind because it's similar to a chimpanzee, actually. We mimic that type of brain. You are dwelling, you are overthinking. It is your first response that is activated when you get a notification from somebody, right? Now, that brain is built, you know where from, Vonda? Our past experiences, our past traumas, things that happened to us in childhood. So that gets activated first. The most successful athletes in the world are able to see what that is, basically accept it, and then activate the logical brain and say, okay, great. Monkey mind has kicked in. I feel like this now. This is just based on a series of past traumas that has happened to me, but let's get logical. I'll reference my bike accident, for example, because it took me around 6 months to get back on the bike. But every time I got back on the bike, I would activate, oh my God, I got hit by a car. Oh my God, I broke my leg, I broke the collarbone, like that would activate. That is that emotional aspect of the brain. But then if I bring it back into logic, it's like, Louisa, you've had your surgery, you're a world-class athlete, you know how to ride a bike, like just get back on it. We're completely safe. You can do this.
And what does it take to be able to make that switch from the monkey hysteria to the logical, I see you, I've got this, now we're going to pivot? What does that take?
That takes a lot, in my opinion, of brain energy, right? So you have to think, and I'm hoping we get into Alzheimer's disease in a moment. Yes. You have to think in terms of business, right? With your brain, you have a supply and demand issue at hand, right? Mm-hmm. We have 87 billion neurons in the human brain, each housing around 5 to 10,000 connections per cell. Those cells, in order to survive and be at their best performing selves themselves, they have to have a lot of supply. The supply comes from nutrients, sleep, if you're exercising, because you get trophic factors that go out and grow and proliferate these neurons. That's a lot of supply to meet the demand. So a demand is the activation of that monkey brain, right? You have to have good maintenance of glucose, good, you don't want to be in a sleep deprived state. You want to be well hydrated so you can meet the demands of those thoughts that are placed upon you. And by the way, Vonda, this is probably the hardest thing in my experience. Get me into, just like you, get me into surgery.
Yeah. It's primitive. It's the go-to default, and it takes energy to pivot out of that. I get that a lot. I mean, I think all successful high-capacity people have to be able, I call it getting out of your head. You have to think in a different way, and not as eloquently as you said it, but I recognize what you're saying. So I was reading that the work you did for your dissertation was all about using resistance training, connecting the physical body to a protective effect in the brain as it related to Alzheimer's disease in older people. And I would love to hear more about how you derived that hypothesis, what question you were answering. And frankly, as you dove deep into the work, were you surprised by anything that you learned?
Oh my gosh. So first and foremost, yes. So my entire dissertation is based on the fact that exercise, specifically resistance training, serves as pretty much medicine. It is a panacea for our brain. Let's talk about why I came to that hypothesis. And it dates all the way back to 1960, actually 1962. Marion Diamond, if you will, she was by far, she is a queen in the neuroscience world. She was the first person to actually find neuroplasticity. And she was the one who separated mice and put one group of mice in an enriched environment where they were running, they were cycling, and then put the other set in a really poor environment. After 6 months, she found that the mice in the enriched environment had greater brain volume. Like, she's like, why do they have bigger brain volume? And she realized it was all because of this wonderful molecule called BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. So when I was digging into the research, that was really interesting. And then I thought, well, this is all based on aerobic exercise. So everybody listening, aerobic exercise, I'm talking when you're generally in this zone 2 efforts and you are training at around 65 to 75% of your maximum heart rate, and you're keeping that, right? You're keeping that steady state cardio for around 45 to 60 minutes a day. And that's wonderful, right? What we do in that aspect is we get the release of BDNF that goes and grows new brain cells in the hippocampus. Fast forward, in 2019, I read this wonderful systematic review that pulled together all of the work ever done on resistance training. And there was a word in there that got me, the hairs on my arms rose. It's called myokines. I know that you know what they are. And I thought, imagine if we could just bottle up a myokine, put it in a syringe and start injecting people. What would that do? You can't do that yet, but I know that like there are companies that are trying to replicate this model. But that was the start and the birth of my love for resistance training and Alzheimer's disease. And then Alzheimer's disease, look, when you go into neurology and neurophysiology, which is what I do, it's part of my that's what I did at university. You have to go into either headache medicine, cancer, or it's like, oh, well, I love Alzheimer's disease, so yeah.
Well, there's just so much to unpack here, because I have also heard you talk about the plaques in Alzheimer's and the fact that they're initially protective, and then they're sticky and they accumulate too much. When you studied the role of resistance training in protecting brain function in Alzheimer's specifically, but brain function in general, is the resistance training protective because it causes a transcription of a protein? In our lab, we used to study a protein. We were looking at muscle-derived stem cells and the role of exercise and musculoskeletal aging. And towards the end of that work, we became fascinated with a protein called Klotho, which is the longevity.
Klotho is... Don't you love me? I'm obsessed with Klotho.
Me too. I am. So what is it? Tell me all the things. Resistance training, I'm biceps curling, the contraction of skeletal muscle causes transcription of what that goes to the hippocampus, to the where? How does it work?
Yeah, I'm really happy that we picked up on that, because there's so many different mechanisms at play here. And I'm going to talk really so everyone can understand, right? Yes. Let's move away from aerobic and let's talk about resistance training. The thing that we get wrong here, Vonda, is nomenclature, really. What is resistance training? Now, in this, what I'm going to be speaking about is lifting heavy weights.
Yes.
For you to get greater brain volume, an increase in your brain size, you have to be lifting, and this is what the clinical literature actually states, 80% of your 1 repetition max.
Yeah, it's heavy.
It's heavy. So
for a few reps.
Well, you want to be doing 4 to 6 reps, right? And let's just say you lift 1 RM for a deadlift is 100 kilos. Your main sets should be 80 kilos, 4 sets, 6 reps. Probably 4 minutes rest between. Like, I don't know who has got time for that. So that's...
Did you say 20 minutes?
No, 4 minutes rest.
Oh, okay. I thought, oh my God, who has room for that? Yeah, but it still adds up, right? It's a lot of...
Yeah, now the mechanisms at play. So what happens is you've got these muscle-based proteins that live inside the muscle cell. Yeah. So generally then, let's just think about this per vector size of your quad. You've got more myokines there than in your bicep. There's more myokines because there's just more muscle fibers. Every time you contract those fibers, you get a release of these myokines. Now, these myokines all serve for something different. You've got myokine irisin, which comes from the Greek word God. Yeah, it is a messenger molecule. And it actually is small enough to pass the blood-brain barrier. And that's the best thing, because BDNF passes it, and so does irisin. So it goes in and it helps with the growth and proliferation of new neurons. It also helps with building stronger connections. Now, how does this relate to Alzheimer's disease? Well, first of all, I keep saying greater brain volume. People think that you can grow new brain cells. You can't. Adult neurogenesis doesn't exist. That's the first thing. When I say grow new neurons, you can grow new neurons in the hippocampus of the brain. Okay. The hippocampus is a seahorse-shaped structure deep in the temporal lobes, arguably the first thing to go during cognitive decline. So we're helping that aspect. But when I say greater brain volume, I'm talking about the connections. Because, Vonda, my hypothesis is, and my belief for Alzheimer's disease is, it is a connection insufficiency. You're not just killing the neurons, you're not killing the cell body, you're killing the synapses between them. So when you exercise through myokines, you grow new synapses, and that's what you see on an MRI with volumetrics in terms of greater brain volume. So these also... Yeah.
a density of connections, not a density of cell bodies, a interplay of the connectivity.
Mm-hmm.
To now, are these proteins transcribe? Are we stimulating transcription, or they're already formed and simply released?
They're formed and simply released, but some of them are transcription factors. So you've probably, I mean, because you talk a lot about bone and bone health and bone mineral density, there's some ones that are specific for bone health, which go in and help with the growth and formation of new bone cells, which is phenomenal, especially for postmenopausal women. But you've got other ones like nerve growth factor, which is essential for the survival and maintenance of certain types of neurons, including sensory neurons and the ones involved in pain perception. So that's one specific myokine. But then you've got another one called glial cell line derived neurotrophic factor. So that's a GDNF, right? And that's involved in the survival of dopaminergic neurons.
Well, important, right?
Yeah, they're very important. So that's important for motor control, and these neurons are affected in Parkinson's disease, for example. You've got neurotropin 3, so NT3, that helps with the growth and survival of neurons and helps with neuroplasticity. So you've got all these different types of myokines. I think the most well-studied one is IL-6, because IL-6 can actually, it's from the interleukin family. We used to think of this as a pro-inflammatory cytokine, but when excreted from the muscle cell, it actually acts as an anti-inflammatory.
And are these proteins released in a sequential manner? Who takes priority? Do we know yet?
We don't know yet, and that's what I'm trying to get to the bottom of. We know that IL-6 and BDNF take priority during aerobic activity, but when you're talking about resistance training alone, there's so many different things to take into play there. But IL-6 is probably the first one to take priority. And in fact, it's because of IL-6, interleukin 6, that we have a reduction in 13 types of cancers due to exercise alone. In fact, 30 minutes a day, just 30 minutes a day, can reduce your risk of 13 types of cancers. And it can also help with cancer metastases, because this IL-6 is actually helping with natural killer cell production. And these natural killer cells go into the tumor site and shrink it. So essentially not allowing you to go from stage 1 to stage 2 cancer.
Right. But when IL-6 does that, is it doing purely of its own action? It's an anti-inflammatory. Is it doing through the action of decreasing the inflammation that can lead to cancers? I heard you that it's through natural killer cell activation, but it must have many functions, is what you're saying.
Many functions. And the only things that we know that there's probably 1,000 myokines, but we only know of about 60. Right. And the only really studied ones that I can just tell you is probably about 15. So
thank goodness. It's a lot to go over.
It's still new research. So I'm getting there. Hopefully there'll be a myokine named Louisa one day.
I hope so. That would be the best.
Yeah.
So years ago, this was early when I was starting out my academic career, there was a study done by, I forget the research, I want to say, I can't remember his name, at the University of Pittsburgh, but his work was on growth of the hippocampus due to a 6-week aerobic exercise regimen, right? So they saw an increase in hippocampal volume with aerobics. You have already told us that to affect the brain, we must lift heavy, which is how I prescribe lifting. And many midlife women that I prescribe that for, it's a foreign concept. Everybody's afraid of getting hurt. And the legs are the largest volume. So when you prescribe exercise, or if you were to mere mortal athletes, would it be mostly leg days, mostly heavy? How do you handle the accessory muscles? Because we can deadlift and we can squat in the heavy ranges, but on the accessory muscles, we pull it back. How do you interplay that if the goal is not only increasing muscle power, because that's what lifting like this will do, is increase power, not hypertrophy, but brain health. So what is the full prescription?
I'm glad you said the goal, because everyone's got a different goal, whether it's longevity or performance. So if it's purely, I want to be able to preserve my cognitive functions when I'm 90 and above, and you want to be lifting heavy, then I prioritize the compound movements first. And this is actually and this is the paper that I published about 6 months ago. There was 2 specific studies in there, the SMART study and the brain power study. And basically it pulls together all of the literature that was done to see outcomes on brain health and performance. You really only need to be doing minimum 2 days a week of heavy lifting. And it really has to be those compound movements. So it's also bang for buck, right? Because you want to get everything in, you want to get your VO2 max training in. There's so many benefits there. You want to get your aerobic. So if you only have 2 days to spend at the gym, I wouldn't be there doing lateral raises with the 5 kilo dumbbells, right? I would be doing compound movements, because it also takes time. I actually have a squat coach. That's how long it takes, because it's just one session is dedicated to squats. Wow. And I'm doing squats, I'm doing deadlifts, I'm doing everything. And like, that doesn't even leave room for plyometrics, really. So if you had to, mere mortals, if you're just getting into it, start with 2 days. If you are completely sedentary, here's the good news. Just doing a wall squat where you're just leaning against the wall for a minute actually will probably have the same benefits as me going into the gym and doing 100 kilo deadlift. So you want to be able to know where you are, track and measure your performance, up your weights. So when you get to that 6th rep, it should be shaking, struggling, need to have a rest for 5 minutes.
I'm glad you said that people can start anywhere, because often people are really intimidated by the very thought of even the name squat and deadlift. But often when I talk to the public or executive groups, I talk to them about wall squatting. I mean, nobody knows what you're doing on the phone. Grab a wall squat, activate some muscles, because you can start with anything. I love that you said that. So 2 days a week is not overwhelming. And do you think then, because I'm just thinking about my own, because in my typical workout for me, I choose one of the compound lifts. If I have legs, let's make the deadlift day, right? And then I do some plyo in between sets, but then the coach that initially taught me to power lift, we would then do several groupings, 3 to 4 exercises of accessory muscles, everything that goes into a deadlift. I'm now sitting here thinking, if time is of the essence, why am I bothering with all those accessory lifts? Let's just get in good sets of deadlifts and squats. Am I just being ridiculous, or?
No, look, it depends on how much time you have, what your goals are. But by the way, the accessory items still serve as so many benefits. We also have to separate, unfortunately, gender and then age. So if we're talking, I'm mid-30s, I'm not perimenopausal yet. I'm not menopausal, evidently, but I will take a different approach as I move into those. And when I know that I'm getting a total reduction in my estrogen, things will have to change. Also, the demands of nutrients will have to change according to how heavy you're lifting. I know that I think you mentioned you take 32 grams per day of protein?
I aim for 130 grams of quality protein a day.
Mm-hmm. So you have to take that into consideration. You have to take how well you are sleeping, because sleep is where you're going to regenerate the muscles and get the release of growth hormone. And then sleep is disrupted in menopausal females, some of them. You've got reductions in brain energy metabolism due to estrogen depletion, a 30% actually. So like bone mineral density, you have to think about all of these things, because the worst thing you can do, the worst thing is get an injury. So that's why I think about age as well, without being discriminative in any sense. Like, I'm like 35 years old now. I cannot even think about doing a triathlon. I'll probably break my leg. But at 20, I was going out the night before and getting podium finishes the following day. Mm-hmm. 2 different things. So I I actually think about how can I not get injured first and foremost, and how can I manage to keep exercising? Because sometimes when I do a really heavy leg day, sometimes I can't even sit on the toilet the following day because I'm like in agony, and it's like, oh my God, what is this? What is this life?
That I'm glad I'm not the only one walking down the stairs backwards because it's too painful. Well, you mentioned what happens as we age in a decade way. And you know what? It's true. I'm a testament. I'm 57 years old and I can still lift really heavy. However, when I was in my mid 30s, not that it was easier, but it was different. I could gain faster. I didn't have to think about injury. I was never injured. I've been injured several times. I fell off a monkey bars in a Spartan race, just things that would, and I think there's a wisdom in thinking the way you did about from a decade standpoint. But when we think of the brain being covered in estrogen receptors, and estrogen is a trophic factor, how do you put that into your model of resistance now where we know estrogen starts to decline around 40 at the latest because of the paucity of eggs we have? How do you put that into your work? And estrogen is such a critical trophic factor for the brain, for everything.
Yeah, it's a trophic factor in a sense that it's neuroprotective. So it does protect the brain. Again, we've got that supply and demand issue, right? BDNF is a trophic factor as well. So the way that I think about it is in terms of reserve. We have cognitive reserve. And basically the way that I like to think about this is preparing my brain and my body for war. So I want to build up as much reserve, meaning I want to build up as much cognitive capacity, as much muscle as possible. So when I get to 40 or 43, so on, I have a little wiggle room in the sense of losing a bit of muscle mass. And it protects you against things that you don't even know what will happen. So for example, 13 days ago, I had another bike accident and it was in New York City. I always ride bikes there and it's been terrible. And I haven't even really been able to exercise since. So it's the same thing. You don't know what you're going to come against. So I think of it as in building reserve as much as possible. I'm also trying to train my brain. This goes back into the earlier part of the episode, train my brain to know to exercise. So I put it at the forefront. I can only imagine, I don't have any kids yet, but I can only imagine what it's like when you do have kids and like when time is of the essence. I think to myself, I'm going to have a home gym. I don't even think I'll have time to go to the gym. So getting all my ducks, I guess, in order for that fourth decade of life.
It's so smart. It's so funny that you just said it like that because I talk about being 40-ish. Pardon my French, but this is my podcast. This is, it's time to get your shit together. 40, the adulting, not that you're not in it, but you know what I mean. If we have not prepared like you have, which is the majority of people, it is time, people, because by the time you hit 50, and both men and women have fluctuations in their hormones, it's harder and harder. So, you know, I love that you have such a forward-facing lifetime view of storehousing resilience, both physical and mental, so that you have something to draw from, right? Because what happens, and I talk about this a lot, what happens is when we don't start at a high enough level and our VO2 max continually drops per decade and our lean muscle mass drops per decade, we cross the independence line, which is, you know, a VO2 max of less than 18 for a man and less than 60, and you can't live alone. So, God, the higher you start, if anybody's listening, take Louisa's example. The higher storehouses you start, the less decay you will see, and the easier it'll be to rebuild, right? Because let's say, I mean, I did this. Exactly what you were saying. At 40, I was in the best shape of my life, New York, running everything, running races. And then life took over. I had a child. And at 47, I didn't even know what was going on. And so life happens. But if you've started with this storehouse, at least I had something to draw from, right?
Yeah. And that brings also another important valid point, which is what I'm doing, right? You can't optimize what you don't measure, right? Now, I was trained using I know how to use an EEG as a neurophysiologist. I was in an epilepsy wards. I did sleep. So I know what an EEG is in a hospital setting. There are a lot of wearable EEGs now. And to me, that's ludicrous. You can't replace an in-hospital, like, yeah, you can't replace that. But the reason I say that is because now we're walking around with these sleep trackers. I've got an Oura Ring on now. But it's important to note that I do use my Oura Ring, and you can use a Whoop and an 8 Sleep. It's not going to completely replicate a PSG, which is a sleep study. So I use these things to track and measure my performance. But one thing that I start with, and this is what I think everyone should, you have to know your baseline. You do a VO2 max test twice a year. And where I'm trying to optimize, Vonda, I'm trying to get into the elite category of the decade below me, right? So I'm like, yeah, so I'm trying, and right now my cardiovascular age is 12 years younger than what I am. So I'm like, okay, how do I get it to 15 years younger? So that's my cardiovascular age. So then it gives me something to work on. I track and measure my heart rate during all my workouts. I use a Garmin and a heart rate monitor strap. So I do that. And then another crucial thing I'm doing, I do blood work, and I do blood work like every 3 months. Now, not everyone should do that. I would say once every 6 months for everyone, but I'm crazy. And it's funny, I just did a hormone panel and I did my biological age, and it's like, great, it says you're 28. I'm like, yes. So now I've got some wiggle room in case at 40, I plan on going overseas and going to Europe and eating pasta for a year.
Well, you would still be running on the cobblestone.
I'd probably still run, yeah.
I predict. Well, but let's talk about something else. I've heard you talk about this, so critical for the brain. And I got to tell you for sure, people do almost anything I ask them to do except give up their refined sugar and give up their wine. You know what? They're willing to go lift heavy. Let us teach them. They're willing to do the VO2 max and the lactate threshold. Talk to me now. Clarify for my audience: the brain uses glucose as fuel, but that does not mean that your blood glucose can be 250 just to fuel your brain. Please clarify this. And I know,
yeah, So the
brain, yeah,
the main energy fuel source for your brain is glucose. And the people who argue against that just don't have a working understanding of the brain just yet. The word ketones are really popular. Now, the brain actually utilizes ketones in a much better way than glucose. But in order to get those ketones, which are produced by the liver, when you deplete your glucose, you have to deplete your glucose. That takes so long. It's not just a few hours of intermittent fasting. No, it is like 3, 4, 5 days of like eating nothing, really. You can, however, have exogenous ketones, and those exogenous ketones can be used as fuel. So meaning you don't need to be eating sugary or refined foods to get that brain energy. That's just stupid. Actually, that's just raising your inflammatory biomarkers, and you're deteriorating blood vessels, and you're actually creating brain fog. You don't want that. You want to be getting clean energy source from clean foods, which is just broken down into glucose anyway.
That's right. That's right. It's just funny. That is commonly said to me, but don't we need it for our brain? Of course, but our body will break down any fuel into glucose for your brain. It doesn't mean you have to overload your entire body.
And that's the same as something that is going on right now on social media, which I hate. I really need to debunk this. People think the same about cholesterol. They're like, but isn't the brain made of fat? And if we eat cholesterol, isn't that good for the brain? And the cholesterol, the molecule is too big to pass the blood-brain barrier. We produce our own cholesterol, right? But the brain is predominantly made of a fat called DHA, which is a polyunsaturated fat that comes from omega-3 fatty acids. Don't confuse the two, please. Please.
You know what? It is not a black box to you, but in general, I mean, as a physician, I can tell you many people, maybe 70% of people, have no idea how their body works from the neck down. I would contend to you, almost no one understands what goes on up here. And so, I think the work you're doing is so important just to clarify what's in our heads physically, the mind, the role of, thank goodness, 2 days a week of heavy resistance training to produce the myokines that will build a better brain, if you will. Because nothing is more important to me, than the maintenance of my brain. If I had to choose one, I would choose my brain over, I hope I never have to choose one. But you know what? It's that important, right?
Well, yeah, your brain is responsible for
everything.
You are actually. It's so devastating if you see end-stage Alzheimer's. You lose who you are. I've had a patient where their son is talking to them, and he's talking to his own mother, and he's like, "Did you ever have kids?" And she's like, "No, I never had kids, but I always wanted to have kids. It just never happened for me." And she's got 3 kids. It's to think that because of lifestyle factors, most of the time, 98% of the time, we are losing who we are is a scary thought to me. And the fact that we don't have a proper therapy or cure for Alzheimer's disease is not okay with me.
Yeah. Well, before we wrap up, I want to talk about how you've incorporated your own life experience as an elite athlete, your own energy deficient state you found yourself in because of your traumatic physical accident, your now PhD, and how you have put it together in a company called Neuro Athletics as a consulting firm. And what is the job of that company?
Yeah. So Neuro Athletics there's 2 arms to it. So I do private coaching, one-on-one. I have 25 clients right now where I'm doing everything in terms of longevity. We're doing a lot of MRIs, blood work, etc. So I work one-on-one with these people. But the biggest aspect of it, and my most wonderful gift in the world, I absolutely love this part of it, is our coaching practice in terms of our coaching education. So I saw a gap in the market in 2019 of all these trainers not understanding longevity. So I think understanding the science and medical practices that people need to increase health span and lifespan is not taught to trainers. Now, in order for me to have a worldwide effect, which is shrinking that mortality curve, I don't want to hear that more people are getting Alzheimer's. I don't want to hear that more people are getting, pediatric cancers are rising. I don't want to hear that. So does it come down to every single person seeing their general practitioner 20 times a year? I don't think people are going to do that. Most people see their trainer. So if I can have an effect on trainers, which is what we do, we have a 6-week course where we teach them the 6 fundamentals of human performance. That's my way of, I guess, getting my mission out there to the world. So it's a coaching practice, it's an education practice, and then it's me coaching as well.
Oh, that's a very brilliant way to amplify your work, because you can only see 25 people one-on-one, but your trainer, the army of trainers, you'll change the world. Well, I'm so thankful you took this time with me today. I love watching your work, and I look forward to so much more of it. So I want to summarize the max min of building a better brain. You have told us 2 days a week, heavy workout, 80% of your one rep max in compound motion. Anything else besides that?
Making sure that you're doing your steady state cardio, if you can, 3 hours a week. It's not that hard. And 20 minutes a week is all that's needed for your VO2 max training.
Do you do the 4-minute on, 4-minute off method, or do you do different intervals?
Yeah, I do 4-minute on, 4-minute off every Monday. If I'm, depending on if I'm excited and want to do another session, I will do a 1-minute on, 1-minute off, which still has the same benefits, by the way. But I make sure to prioritize the 4 on, 4 off. And that's all that's needed to raise and move the needle. Just 1 session a week.
which is great when the min-max principle is the overriding principle. So, well, thank you for your time. I am going to post everywhere how people can, especially the trainers that follow me, they like when I tell them that the one thing that will save your life is lean muscle mass. And so,
love that.
Where they can reach you for your 6-week course. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Vonda. You're amazing.
I'm Dr. Vonda Wright. See you next week.